Hello, everybody, and welcome to another conversation in our series on seeking harmony. Today, we are exploring the economic crisis in China that has not really been as publicized. So not many people really know what's happening in that space. There's also some new legislation in the United States that's looking at climate change and inflation reduction. And then there was also something around the first 4-star Black general being sworn in the US Army. So I'd like to open it up to the team and see which topic they would like to kick off with. And we will just have a flowing conversation. To everybody that is following us, please feel free to like and subscribe to our Church of Union YouTube channel, but also share your thoughts and feelings around what we're sharing today. And also, if you have any topic suggestions that you'd like us to delve into deeper, we also welcome that. So please feel free to share that with us as well.
Hey.
Hi.
Would you like to begin? I feel like you had something to say, Sage.
No, I thought you had something to say. No. Yeah, I can start though. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that the biggest topic feels like they would be the China debt crisis topic, I think. And I feel like it is interesting because that is not super high profile in the media right now. And I think that, that there might be a reason for that, why it isn't as high profile as it is for, how big of an issue it is. And I think that, yeah, it's definitely something like worth delving into. And yeah, so Jeff, one of our gurus, our spiritual teachers, told us about this and said, that there is this financial bubble, this like real estate bubble in China, basically where the value of housing and of real estate developers in China is dropping, and it's set to drop because so people are refusing to pay their mortgages on their homes in China because the homes that they're paying for haven't been built yet, and the companies that are constructing them are saying that they aren't making progress on them because they don't have the money to do so. And so I was like, first, like wrapping my head around this, and second, like not really understanding at first, like what a big economic issue this was. But yeah, I think like to summarize it, basically, companies in China that develop real estate, we're seeing this as a huge cash opportunity for a lot of reasons. And partly because in China, like owning a home is a really big deal, even more so than in other countries. It's seen as like something that's strategic for like getting married. Like, if a man owns real estate, that it makes him more attractive to women. And there's like this imbalance of men versus women in China because male children were preferred, in the one-child policy meant that there would be fewer children. And if parents were going to have a child, they would prefer to carry a male pregnancy to term. And so anyway, that's part of this, but there's like So some of the companies that were building new housing for people, which people already like put a down payment on, and we're already paying mortgage payments for this, right? They are running out of money to construct homes because the money that they are being paid for these houses that aren't yet built, they were trying to invest into buying even more land. So instead of using that money to do the job that they stated for these people, they were betting on more and more and more people are going to be interested in investing. And so we're going to get more and more and more money flowing in. And that is going to increase the value of the properties that we're selling. And the math is all going to work out. So instead, they have been buying up more land to build more homes, but without more people investing in them, they don't actually have the money to be building the homes that they promised to build already. So clarify that if you want, but that's my understanding of it. I was never much of an economics person. Like, economics class was like really hard for me in college, but I had to take it for as a requirement. So, but that's what it sounds like to me. It sounds mostly like it sounds like it's an effort to like be kind of overreaching and being like a little bit like greedy or money hungry, and just like taking that money, instead of doing the job, investing it more into something that people don't want as much. So then then it all collapses. Okay. That is my summary. Tell me what you think.
Yeah. Trust me, I was not her best at economics either in college. So I understand. But I think we can have a conversation still.
I think we can still talk about it.
Economics noobs. You know, one of the things that struck me when you started talking is that most of the worldwide economic crisis that we have known in the 21st century started with like real estate crisis in one country. Like at the beginning of the 2000s, like the healthy financial slope, so to say, of the world started to decrease, because in like Spain, I think real estate had started to decline. And then like the 2008 crisis, like I think it was the United States housing market that was starting to decline. And so I think one of the reasons why Jeff pointed us to this, aside from the real fact that nobody is really talking about it right now, is that, you know, real estate and the bubble of real estate is when it's prone to burst, like it's prone to creating like a crisis of a global state, basically, and something that would impact like everyone. And because China is like seen as one of the most powerful countries in the world, like we're prone to have to see and feel the impact of such a market like collapsing, I think. But yeah, I think Granville wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, so I think what we need to do is probably take a little bit of a step back just for a second. So one of the things about property that doesn't necessarily always apply to other possessions is that, or investments, is that property appreciates where other investments depreciate. So that would mean that as an investment vehicle, property would be attractive to invest in, which is what attracts people to that kind of thing. So the growth that you experience in investing in property is likely to be higher than most other classes of assets. So that's a very attractive combination when you look, it's an attraction factor when you look at wealth creation. So this is what attracts people. Now you have a bunch of very, well, some are, especially in China, and I'm not certain in most other countries, but some are state-owned versus privately owned. And this crisis in China in terms of housing has affected the privately owned property developers, to the extent that some of them are coming close to declaring bankruptcy. So all of that sounds very simple economics, you know, it's cycles of what happens. The challenge is that given that China is a manufacturing hub for the world, and that we've already seen shortages in terms of imports to our countries for the tech that they manufacture, we can see that a housing crisis will impact on the availability of tech, which we're already experiencing. Like in South Africa, we actually have a shortage of laptops for being imported. We have a shortage of parts for copiers and things like that. And most of that tech is actually innovated and manufactured in China.
Yeah.
And so the spillover effect is quite significant. And then when you look at their property development space, they have their hand in property development. I think I read like in 80 of 139 countries, they have some level of part in road development, bridge development, those kind of things. So the impact is it's kind of dual in that it impacts the infrastructure in other countries, but it also probably impacts the ability of other countries' workforce to be productive where there are shortages of tech that enable work. So the ripple, you know, like, so the ripple is no longer a ripple. It starts to become a wave. And it starts to become a series of waves. And so that series of waves over time, if there's a backup, build up and wash away things, similar to how a tsunami would build up, kind of thing. And I think that's the bubble that we're seeing bursting, is that China has grown and innovated, sometimes at the expense of sensibility. And this is what you're speaking to, Sage, when you say, as opposed to the money that people are paying for, prepaying for apartments off plan and all of those things being used to build those actual apartments, land is being bought with that money, which means that there's always a gap. You always have to fund it somehow. And funding becomes expensive, especially in an economy where there's a shortage of the supply of other things. So there's no money properly flowing in, and the money that is flowing in is being used in the wrong place.
Exactly, yeah.
So, and then of course, I mean, you know, like as I said at the beginning, that wealth attraction or wealth growth perspective is very attractive to people. And I think that this is what has happened with these property developers as well, because there was a boom in demand.
Yeah.
because their property development space contributes to 30% of their GDP, which is significant. And so if that contribution is not there, the GDP growth slows down. Something needs to stimulate it. But people are, Chinese people specifically, are saying, I'm not paying for something that I'm not getting. I'm not paying for something that I don't know when I will get. And I think that's where the kind of the stew has boiled over from the pot into the fire. You know, so it's quite a messy thing, and that's from what I've read. And again, like we've all said, we're not really economists, but at the same time, we also understand the concept of wealth creation and investment to an extent. And honestly, if I were to have an investment portfolio, I'd most likely put a greater focus on offshore and property development and those kind of things, because that's the space that grows. That's the space that shows you that gives you the greatest growth in your investment. So it affects not only people's investments, but currently it will affect their livelihoods. Because if it's in a manufacturing hub and the workforce doesn't have housing, it impacts on their ability to deliver what they are meant to be manufacturing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're right about that. And I think, yeah, we can illustrate it that quickly by saying like they're the manufacturers of the world, right? But that was built on the government's promise that they would get 2-3 times richer or more. And so they produced so much and they sold it to people. So in turn, like they started gaining a little bit of wealth, which was reinvested by the people in real estate, which in turn gave more capital to the government, because we know these companies were investing in the government. And we knew like the capitals were not like really stable, but they had so much of it that they had to reinvest it outside in the world, like in countries like Africa, building roads, in Dubai, building buildings, things like that. And and the government's promise is that this sort of double loop would close on itself and start to bring riches over and over again to people. And we're seeing that it's not the case. And it's not the case because it was built on kind of a lie, Economics, like you try to.
It's treated as a get rich quick scheme, and it's not.
Yeah.
So what you're having is a greater demand than the supply can cope with.
Exactly.
Their housing market. Economically, that's already a recipe for disaster.
Isn't it the opposite, that they're generating too much supply and there isn't enough demand?
No.
That people aren't wanting the homes?
No, so what has happened was they have basically
because people are saying
what they haven't built yet. So there's a greater demand than a supply. So there's a gap here. And as of closing the supply gap, they're going to invest in more property so that they can build more. But they're not even supplying what's been paid for in the first place.
Exactly, because the capital was not like, as we've seen, the capital was on infrastructures that were not built yet. Exactly. So in theory, they're rich. But in reality, and that's why it's so unstable and that people don't trust Chinese currency so much around the world, is because like everyone knows that, these are not built yet. So it's not a market that it's rich yet. So it's capital, but it doesn't have so much value. Like it just like, it kind of, it's trying to get rich, but also by poisoning like all the markets. you know, kind of, and I think Jeff mentioned that a few months ago also, but yeah, basically, if you're everything that is built on something that is not true will affect negatively the market, and you can't try to cheat the game or bypass all of these things.
Mhm.
And China has done so for like maybe 15, 20 years. So I mean, they're basically starting to see how poisonous it can be to try to cheat the game and try to gain riches on something that is not real. And that's why their economic bubble was so real. And when it's going to burst, like basically it's going to cause it's already causing so much like distress for people, and also like economic recession, probably for a lot of people, Chinese or otherwise. But yeah.
Yeah, because the other thing is that like specifically when it comes to manufacturing, if there's a higher demand than what there is a supply, it means that what you have can be sold at higher prices, which is what actually influences inflation in other spaces. Because as opposed to paying a certain amount for a certain thing, you're going to pay higher for it because imports are more expensive because there's a bigger demand. Well, there's a demand that's not being met, basically. And that's really just from a manufacturing space. And then we look at the property market, and that's also imploding. So there's a big implosion happening, and the ripple effect is really that the rest of the world is likely to feel it quite a bit, given the trade relationships we have with China.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I looked up some of the statistics of it, and yeah, I think it said China produces like 16% of the world's exports. The whole European Union exports like a little bit less than that, like the entire thing. And then the US a little bit less than that. So it's like a really big player. And I understand what you're saying. So that if the demand is huge and their ability to supply is low, they'll want to sell at a higher price because they can. That raises inflation for everyone else because they're paying more for these goods. And I think another thing to take into account is that the central, like the People's Bank of China, like the central bank, has been responsible for not only like giving loans out to those property developers, but also giving out billions of dollars of loans to a bunch of poor countries that aren't very creditworthy, with the idea that, oh, they won't be able to pay back their loans. Awesome. We'll take possession of their assets and we'll basically own them. And that's actually what happened in Sri Lanka, because there's an entire port in Sri Lanka that China owns now because Sri Lanka couldn't pay them back for the construction of it. So that's kind of their plan, basically. But the problem with that plan is that it involves not being paid back. And so that means that so they're planning on not being paid back as part of their geopolitical strategy, which sucks. If you're
poisonous.
Yeah, see, because they didn't take into account that that's a big problem if you're also not getting paid back by these real estate companies that also owe you. So the real estate companies owe you, they're not paying you back. These poorer countries owe you, they're not paying you back, which is what you kind of wanted. And meanwhile, like then you can't offer as much credit to businesses and to business because I also learned like the Chinese government gives a lot of loans out to manufacturers too. Like businesses in China are very indebted too, because the people didn't have the money to start the business in any other way, so they borrow it from the government. And so that's what they have to do. So that's going to decrease their ability to manufacture. So it's like there's this, it's basically like they're giving out all of these loans hoping that there's a return on some of it at least, and in other cases just purposely giving bad loans to entrap others, and then it's all just collapsing because they're not getting the return they wanted. And it just sounds like it was all kind of like ill-intentioned, and it's just like coming back to bite them, I guess.
It sounds even more aggressive than trying to take Taiwan.
Right. Yeah.
It's a little bit creepy. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, it's creepy. That's why I always felt weird about the fact that like people would tell us that like they're like, make sure to get a good education because China is going to replace us in the world. Like that's what a lot of Americans would say. Like my high school principal gave a big speech about that and was saying like, oh, the Chinese are gonna take your jobs, like your high paying jobs, you know, and they're gonna.
The thing is that they presented as a powerful country, and so everyone believed them, and they built their system and trust in the world on that notion that they were just probably gonna be like the second power ever in the world, in all places, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was also a lie, and also a bubble in a way, because like
so I actually don't think it was a lie, because what you've got is people that have educated themselves probably 2 or 3 times more than their counterparts.
Yeah.
And so what you're finding, and you would find it, because in order to entrench yourself in a place, you kind of need to be invasive, which is really what has happened with lower cost manufacturing, specifically in places like China and India. They absorbed manufacturing from other Western countries and European countries because of the fact that they were able to manufacture at lower costs. And by standard, economically, a company is going to look for the cheapest producer of their goods. So there's kind of a fine line of, they were a little bit insidious in their strategy. The problem is, as you said, Sage, there's probably a bit of ill intent behind the strategy that's actually come back to bite them, because of the fact that you cannot win at the expense of other people. It doesn't work like that. A pure universal law of cause and effect will tell you that. A pure universal law of reciprocity will tell you that. You know, that if there's a bad energy exchange, then that energy exchange will rebound. It's just what it is. So there's a lot of nuances that we also need to take into consideration in saying, yes, some things have happened, but in other spaces, there's also been the rebound of the ill intention. And then, of course, you can't expand at the expense of your own people and expect them not to get tired of it at some point. Like I'm really not going to pay for something that I don't have the benefit of using.
Yeah. And there's also, that a factor of like the Chinese, so, Chinese banking, like being, the central government, being in charge of these banking systems means that there aren't as many like checks and balances as if you were in like a democratic state that's like well developed, like the US. So one thing that happened that I thought was really interesting that points to like deception is that a lot of people's bank accounts in China, they thought were just like bank accounts that they could withdraw money from. But they were then told recently that these accounts were actually investment accounts that they can't just draw money from. And also that the money that they put in these banks is an investment into these companies that are now losing money and going bankrupt. So the money you thought was there for your use that you would make money on, but not, you would have a guarantee of being able to get it back, actually is all up for risk. It's all on the line, being invested in these companies that aren't exactly, earning money back right now. Yeah, so that's what that.
They basically transform debit accounts into savings accounts?
No, they were
something?
transforming either.
Oh,
I think
yeah.
they were
No,
transforming savings
that's
accounts into like investment accounts. So as if you were like, it's like my understanding was that it's like,
yeah, you loan money to people. It's an account where you loan money to people and get it back, like how banks
yeah,
function. So.
it sounds like it. It sounds like it was more like yeah, that your money was, it was almost like having like a stock portfolio or something, or like shares of a company, that's what you put your money into instead of it being like a general savings account. And there being like a guarantee that I can get up to like $250,000 back, like in the US, like federally you're insured, like all of your accounts are insured up to $250,000. But the Chinese banks were trying to say, we'll give you back like some money right now, but there's no guarantee of any more, so we're just going to give you some just to say that just to like appease you basically. But people are like, no, we're losing a lot of money through this. You didn't tell us that we could lose money this way.
Okay.
Yeah. So it seems like it's like, I think it's pointing to dishonesty, and I feel like it points to how maybe the consciousness was like, in order to advance our nation and become a power on par with other powerful countries, we need to do something that is a little bit unrealistic at best, or maybe a little bit shady, because we want to like quickly rise up as a nation, and we want to quickly become a great power. And that kind of feeling of like comparison maybe, or a feeling of like, being slighted by the world, because historically like China was, kind of economically exploited by Europeans. It was like invaded by the Japanese during World War II and like devastated. So when China, like the second half of the 20th century, they were a very impoverished country. And I feel like there might have been a desire to like, let's quickly become a great power, but trying to do it in a way that wasn't the most like honest or ethical, because there's a feeling of like, let's be the ones dictating the world's policy instead of being people who get dictated to. And while that it's good to like build up power and influence, in a positive way, it's not good to try to do that through these means. And I think that's what this is showing,
Yeah, it feels to me a bit like there's a core of trying to control something, and also maybe a core of a little bit of greed, like because for me it's underhanded to use. Because technically what is happening here is that the benefit of the use of those funds doesn't go to the investor. It goes back to the bank or the government, especially given that they didn't even know that they were investing in the first place. Right. And so what happens with investment accounts generally is banks do use it as a lending tool. But the investor gets some benefit from the banks using your money to fund and loan people money and all those other things. This seems like people weren't getting the benefit of their investment because they didn't even know that they had invested. So it was like very, very almost insider trading against your own people kind of shit. And it just sounds awful.
Maybe not trading, but like, I feel like the pattern is gaining power by taking from your people over and over again. What if you work like 10 times harder than everyone else so that China would become a great power? And then you give that money to the states over and over again with your bank, with your lifestyle, with your real estate, you know, and so it's taking on all sides. And for people, it wasn't taking back because they thought that it would be a relationship. Like, you know, I give you, you give me, things like that.
Yeah, it sounds like a socialist communist mechanism that masqueraded as democracy.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's.
Oh, like it's almost like the government owning all of this secretly when it was supposed to be like the people privately own stuff. Yeah, okay, that kind of concept.
Yeah, because there are a lot of countries that masquerade as something politically and then have a whole of a system economically. So I think China is a good, I guess, representation of that. So
well, given what we're seeing that type of representation in China right now, because you know, like it sounds like the core of it is very socialistic, and yet it's not quite publicized. It's like, you know, that the concept of Big Brother owns everything and then gives you rations. I feel like this is what it is.
Yeah, I think it's more of like the state really propping up private businesses, like state capitalism, which was more like, it's more like what came what rose up in like the fascist era, the era of like fascism, like Nazi Germany was a really good example of this, of like the government being like, hey, private business, we'll help you, you know, we'll fund you, we'll finance you, we'll help you and promote you like in a really big way. Whereas like in the United States and like other countries, it's not quite like that. Like that businesses are more responsible for, you know, building themselves up within the community of private business. Whereas I think the Chinese government wouldn't have a big hand in doing that, in supporting businesses, as you can see with like their central bank, like giving out all of these loans, you know, to private companies. And I feel like that, yeah, I feel like it's like trying to like have the government, it feels like it's like trying to have the government be both the savior and also like the master, as we can see, like of the people, because like all these communist movements and revolutions where the idea was that the government would be like there for the people and would rise up against the powerful and, you know, push back against them and help create a utopian society. And that it, you know, yeah, that it would be like, you know, led by this government that was for the people. But it doesn't end up being that way if they are corrupt and they don't serve that purpose, basically.
Yeah, and you know, the other concern would be that as these private property developers and private companies start to default on their loans given to them by the central bank of China, the People's Bank of China, the consequence of it could be that they start to take over management and ownership of those companies. So more and more becomes state-owned, which just entrenches the philosophy of socialism even more.
Yep, but we'll see. We'll see how this develops, basically. Alrighty.
Yeah, alrighty.
That was a lot.
Yeah.
That was a big subject. Yeah. But yeah, I feel like we can move on to the United States bill on climate change and inflation reduction, which is another big topic, especially in terms of economics, because like we're unsure how this will go. But yeah, like a few weeks ago when it made the news, like I feel like it seemed like a big success to have voted this bill in. And yeah, I wanted to ask you guys, Americans, like if you have any more information about it, like if you know what is going on with this bill and kind of explain it to us.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, the climate part of the bill was including like the the government's investment into like doing things like flood proofing homes and stuff like that, and helping people cope with climate change, things like that, providing like the government would have money that they could like invest to help the development of like clean energy infrastructure and stuff like that in the US. And part of this bill too was that they are trying to make sure that corporations like pay at minimum 15% taxes on their profits. And there were like some loopholes basically that they wanted to close because they need a way to like fund this. And so they're trying to close those loopholes, make sure corporations pay the taxes that they need to pay. So that is like part of it. The big like sticking point with it was if the government was going to make all these funds available for for companies to develop green energy infrastructure, this was seen as a threat to interests like fossil fuel companies who don't benefit from that and who benefit from the country like being dependent still on fossil fuels. So the people who were tied up more in that interest in the Senate, like Joe Manchin, who is a Democrat, but he's from West Virginia. So a lot of attention was on him because he basically would not support this type of bill. And so compromises were put in. One of them was that like 20 million, I don't remember, it's like 20 million acres of land area will be opened up to companies who might want to like drill oil there. And 600 million acres will be opened up offshore for oil drilling too, for companies. So it's kind of like, it's kind of going in both directions at once, because on one hand, all of this money being made available for like clean energy infrastructure and everything. On the other hand, all this land being made available for fossil fuel companies to like bid on, and so it's kind of, yeah, like going two ways at once to try to appease people and find some deal that moves things forward, which otherwise it wouldn't. And so that's cool that something was able to move forward. There's some caveats too, because it sounds like, oh, they're making like millions of acres available, right, to these oil companies, but it's such huge tracts of land. Very few of them are actually going to end up being usable and actually containing oil, because it's not like all of that land like contains oil under it. So they are, companies will buy some of it, and then they might explore it, and then they might find there's not even oil under here, or they might, you know what I mean? Like you could buy land and end up finding that you can't use it, or there's no oil there. So that's part of it. And part of it too is that from the time when the project is started, it takes like 4 to 10 years for oil to start being produced from a project, so like they selected the site and they're like, let's start drilling, let's start doing all of this. It's going to be like 4 years at minimum until you start to see oil. So you could also see that as being like, well, this isn't like such a huge concession to fossil fuel companies, but it kind of is. So yes, that is my summary at the end. And what do you guys feel about this or think? Do you guys have any more details to fill in? Because it was like a big act of Congress. Yeah.
I think something that stood out for me was also the capping of certain prescription medications and things like that, specifically insulin and that kind of thing. And given that it's probably for people, so that, and I think it was termed as funding certain private healthcare things in the States. I think it's probably something that's quite important from a individual living standards point of view, because if you are diabetic and insulin is that expensive, it just becomes a drain on your personal resources for a health challenge. And yes, some people can say change your lifestyle, but sometimes it's not just as simple as changing a lifestyle. Sometimes your body has changed. Things are adjusted. You are born with certain conditions. And so I feel like it does also speak to some real issues. It's not just now fossil fuels and major companies. It's actually healthcare at an individual level where prescription medication tends to become quite expensive.
Yeah, I didn't really understand what the plan was for health insurance, because I don't know all the terminology that you use, guys, talking about health insurance. And it was like, well, I hope it's not going against like the communication and plan that Vice President Kamala Harris has made over the past few months about like ensuring that insurance was a thing for people and the continuation of health for citizens. And like what I'm seeing is that also with climate change, it's like, I understand that we need funding and that one solution is like kind of a short-term sacrifice for the long-term thing, which on paper feels good, but also brings up that contradiction of like, well, why? Like you're in favor of climate change and taking the risk of drilling up more land, like millions of acres. Why taking the risk to fund this? And I know like doing a bill like that is super difficult, and obviously in a system like we live in, there are going to be like compromises and sacrifices. But yeah, I wonder like how it's gonna play out basically. But I feel it's like in alignment with what Biden has presented in the past few months of like, wanted to go forward with like preserving the country and ensuring that there's a stability financially and also for climate change, but not wanting to go against all the people, and with reason, because otherwise he's not going to be reelected, or Democrats are going to like lose more seats in parliament, and all of that would have been for nothing anyways. So yeah, I think like there are a lot of like things mixing up in this, which makes for people seeing this as a complex thing and maybe being confused. And obviously there are reasons why this bill was made as it was right now, and I understand these reasons, but it does still feels like there are loopholes, and obviously, like as you said, they're trying to close them, but I think I'm curious how it's going to unfold as well, because it's so very new and it's never easy to deal with like big oil companies or make decisions on climate change, or like being 100% sure that your plan for funding and reducing inflation is going to work 100%, because like as we've seen during this whole hour, you can try to plan and illustrate as much as you can. Like sometimes economics is economics and it's gonna do what it's gonna do, and you couldn't ever plan it if you wanted to. So yeah, I don't know, how do you guys feel about that? Like this contradictions and confusion, do you feel like a necessary means to an end, or like how do you feel about that basically?
So I think that's a very interesting postulation. Is it a necessary means to an end or not? And I think there's a deeper question here of what is the actual benefit? And the actual benefit is that we probably live in a world that's healthier to live in, which might mean that healthcare reduces, or the requirement for healthcare to reduce. So the less fossil fuels are a thing, the less it affects your health. We are very fully aware that as we go along, there are natural resources in the world that would continue to be depleted. And so there is a requirement to explore alternative energy sources, and clean energy is just that. It's an alternative energy source that's probably going to be healthier in the long run for the planet and for its inhabitants. So possibly the necessary evil part is getting agreement by giving concessions around fossil fuels. But at the same time, it also opens up the avenue to invest into cleaner energy sources, which might not have been that way had the concession not been given. Might have been a longer battle, might have taken a longer time to reach a level of agreement. So is it a necessary evil? Probably. Will it bite us in the short term? Maybe. Will it bite us in the longer term? Maybe less. It's kind of one of those conjecture things where you kind of, as you said, you kind of need to see how it unfolds. And again, the unfoldment is not likely to be seen in this generation. It might even be seen in the next generation. But the fact of the matter is it's a start in the direction of finding alternative energy sources which are needed.
makes me think of like actually an economics quote that says, it's from the early 20th century, I think, and it's someone that says like capitalism is like the less worse system that we could have right now. It's like in the system that we live in, like sometimes we have to find that the less worse thing to kind of advance.
2 or 3 evils.
Yeah, to kind of advance and things like, yeah, I don't know, maybe it will change because like obviously our world is like the Luciferian system, and as we come to know of, you know, spirituality and heaven on earth, like we could have some other solutions that don't require sacrifice. But yeah, it's basically like how we've been working from that 200 years, is like finding the less worth things and building onto that and advancing onto that and having technological advancement and so on and so forth. So yeah, just keeping that in mind, and again curious to see how it's going to unfold.
Yeah. And I think that it is probably the least worst option, because now we can have the federal government offering financial support to help clean energy companies develop, and it's going to be bigger scale than maybe what like a state government or a local government could support. Because like maybe a state government wouldn't support that, or a local government wouldn't support that, but some would. So it's kind of patchy. And energy infrastructure, I feel like, is like way more efficient when it's on a greater scale. And, it makes more sense that way. And that's kind of why utilities are like owned by the government, and it's like one big central like utility company for like an entire area, of a country or a state. So that could be helpful. But yeah, I agree that it's still kind of like a compromise, but hopefully it will be an investment that helps clean energy, green energy, like really take off, like it gives it a foothold. And so then eventually, because it has a foothold now that is better, it could replace fossil fuels faster anyway. And so that, you know what I mean? So that could be helpful. Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, we have reached our hour. And so I'm going to say thank you to everybody for the conversation today, and to the people that have followed us. Thank you. And please feel free to like and subscribe to our Church of Union YouTube channel, where you'll find all our previous conversations. And we look forward to seeing all of you next week. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.